The Larathi trade convoy was 3 hours past the dead zone when the scanner officer screamed. Not a shout of surprise or a yelp of confusion, but a genuine scream that made every crew member on the bridge freeze in place and turn to look at her. She pointed at her screen with a shaking finger and said 2 words that had not been spoken in any official capacity in over 3,000 years. Vraketh Biosign. The bridge erupted into chaos. Captain Selhari pushed through the noise and looked at the screen herself, and felt her stomach drop, because the scanner officer was right, and there was no mistaking that particular biological signature, because the galactic database still carried it flagged in red, with 17 separate warnings attached to it. But there was something else on that screen too. A second biosign, sitting right next to the first one, and this one was warm and small and stubbornly alive in a way that made no sense at all on a planet where nothing should be living. It was human. 11 days earlier, Commander Declan Harrow had watched his reactor blow a seal and turn his ship into an expensive piece of junk sitting on the surface of Kethara Prime, which was itself an expensive piece of junk sitting in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. Kethara Prime had been the main battlefield of the Varathi Syndicate War, and that war had ended 3,000 years ago, and nobody had bothered to clean up afterward, because nobody wanted to come here, because the air tasted like battery acid, and the ground was littered with the bones of civilizations that no longer existed. Declan was a former United Terran Marine turned freelance salvager, which was a polite way of saying he flew alone into terrible places and pulled out things he could sell. And it was not a job for people who scared easily. He was not scared now, but he was annoyed. His water recycler was working, but his food was running low. Ship needed a new coupling array, and the only place to find parts compatible with anything was the ruins of the old Varathi military installations, buried under the rock and rubble of this dead world. So he went digging. He had been digging for days now, crawling through collapsed tunnels and shattered bunkers with a headlamp and a plasma cutter, and the kind of stubborn patience that his old drill sergeant had once described as too stupid to know when to quit. On the 11th day, he found the bunker. It was deep underground past 2 cave-ins, and a corridor that had partially flooded with something that was not water, but was close enough that he tried not to think about it. And at the end of that corridor was a door that still had power running to it, which should have been impossible after 3 millennia. But the Varathi had built things to last, even if they had not built them to be kind. He cut through the door and stepped inside, and his headlamp swept across it. Room that had been sealed since before humanity had invented the steam engine. There were supply crates stacked against the walls, and most of them had rotted or corroded into nothing, and there were racks that might have once held weapons, and a console that was long dead and dark. And in the center of the room, sitting on a platform that still hummed with the faintest trace of power, was a stasis pod. It was enormous. Declan walked around it slowly and wiped the grime from the observation panel with his sleeve and looked inside. The thing in the pod was the size of a grizzly bear. If a grizzly bear had 6 legs, and a hide made of cracked armored plates, and a face that looked like someone had taken the ugliest parts of a warthog and the ugliest parts of a deep-sea anglerfish, and smashed them together without any concern for the result. It was covered in scars and old acid burns that had healed badly, and one of its eyes was a sealed mass of scar tissue. Bioluminescent markings, which ran in lines down its spine and across its flanks, were dark and cracked like dried riverbeds. It was the most hideous thing Declan had ever seen, and Declan had once seen a man eat a live cockroach on a dare, so that was saying something. He looked at the designation plate on the pod, and his translation software chewed on the ancient Varathi script for a moment, and then spat out the words, Unit 0 Ket 9, surplus disposal pending. Declan read that twice. He looked back at the creature in the pod. Disposal pending. They had not even bothered to kill it. They had just marked it for disposal, and then left this planet, and left this bunker, and left this creature in a failing stasis pod for 3,000 years, like a piece of broken equipment that was not worth the energy to destroy. Declan had seen a lot of things in his years as a Marine and a salvager, and he had developed a thick skin about most of them. But something about those two words made his jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He checked the pod readings, and his suit translated them slowly, and the numbers were bad because the stasis field was failing, and had probably been failing for centuries, and the creature inside was not frozen in perfect preservation, but was instead slowly dying, one cell at a time, in the longest and loneliest death imaginable. Its remaining eye was closed, and its breathing was so shallow that the fog on the observation panel came and went like a whisper. Declan stood there for a long time. He knew what this thing was. He was not stupid, and his suit had access to the Galactic database. And the database was very clear about what a Vraketh was, and what it could do, and why every species in the known galaxy had celebrated when they were declared extinct. A single Vraketh had been designed to be deployed against entire armies, and they had been very good at their job, and the list of species they had helped drive to extinction was not short. Every rational thought in his head told him to walk away and seal the door and report the coordinates, and let the galactic military come and do whatever they thought was appropriate, which would almost certainly involve a lot of firepower. But Declan looked at the scars and the cracked armor and the dark markings and the designation that said this creature had been thrown away like garbage, and he thought about every stray dog he had ever seen on every miserable backwater planet he had ever visited. And he said out loud to no one, because there was no one else on this entire planet, "Well, you look like shit, and that makes two of us." He found the emergency release on the pod, and he pulled it. The stasis field died with a sound like a long exhale, and the pod hissed open, and warm, foul air rolled out, and the creature inside shuddered and made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a moan, and it was the sound of something waking up into pain after a sleep that had lasted longer than most civilizations. Obedience, and it was not the handler loss protocol, and it was not any of the control mechanisms that had been wired into its DNA. It was something much older and much simpler. It was the recognition of one abandoned thing finding another. The galactic news networks picked up the story within 48 hours, and they did not handle it well. The headline that ran across most major feeds translated roughly to "Human stranded with live Vraketh on dead world," and the reaction from every species that remembered the old wars was immediate and loud, and not at all calm. Emergency sessions were called in 6 separate governing bodies, and military fleets in 3 sectors were put on standby alert, and the Larathi trade convoy that had first detected the biosigns was ordered to hold position and maintain surveillance from orbit. Everyone agreed on one thing. The human was already dead, and this was now a containment problem. Except the human was not dead. The human was in fact sitting on the floor of a collapsed Varathi bunker, trying to get a dying alien war beast to drink nutrient paste dissolved in recycled water from a makeshift bowl he had fashioned out of a helmet liner. Well, the creature that Declan had already started calling ugly was in terrible shape, and that was putting it generously. Because the truth was that ugly was in the kind of shape that most field medics would look at and quietly pull a blanket over. 3,000 years of decaying stasis had eaten it from the inside out, and its muscles had atrophied to the point where it could barely stand on its 6 legs, and its bioarmor was cracked and flaking, and the skin beneath was raw and weeping, and its one good eye was clouded with pain, and its breathing came in short, ragged bursts that sounded wet in a way Declan did not like. It was also confused and terrified and angry, which was a dangerous combination in any animal, but was an especially dangerous combination in an animal that had been designed to dissolve tank armor with its saliva. Ugly snapped at him 14 times in the first day. Not full attacks, but warning snaps with jaws that could have taken his arm off. The shoulder, and each time Declan pulled back just enough, and then moved forward again slowly, with his hands open and his voice low and steady. He talked to it constantly. Not commands, because he did not know any Varathi command words, and would not have used them even if he did, because he had read enough about the Vraketh in the Galactic database to understand that their entire existence had been nothing but commands, and he was not going to be another voice telling this creature what to do. Instead, he just talked. He told it about Earth and about the town where he grew up, which was small and flat and surrounded by fields that turned gold in autumn. And he told it about his mother, who had rescued every stray animal in a 50-mile radius until their house was more shelter than home. And he told it about the Marines, and the things he had seen, and the friends he had lost, and the reason he flew alone now. He talked, because humans talk when they are scared and when they are tired, and when they are trying to keep something alive that the universe seems determined to kill. And slowly something changed. Ugly stopped snapping on the second day. On the third day, it ate the nutrient paste. On the fourth day, Declan woke up from an exhausted sleep on the bunker floor, and found that Ugly had dragged itself closer to him during the night, and was lying with its massive scarred head less than a foot from his legs, and its one good eye was watching him with something that was not aggression, and was not fear, but was instead a cautious and fragile curiosity. Declan looked at it and said, "Good morning, Ugly," and the creature made a low rumbling sound in its chest that vibrated the floor. On the sixth day, Ugly collapsed. Its remaining biological systems were failing one by one, and the nutrient paste was not enough, because its body had been designed to process specific Varathi combat rations that had not existed for 3 millennia, and it was starving in a way that food alone could not fix. Declan watched it go down, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, because he had watched things die before, and he knew what it looked like, and this looked like that. He had 2 choices. He could accept it, and make the creature comfortable, and let it go, and that would be the rational thing to do, and no one in the galaxy would blame him. Or he could do the other thing. He chose the other thing. He tore apart his ship's medical bay, and pulled out every piece of equipment he had, and he cross-referenced Varathi biological data from the Galactic database with his own marine field medic training, and he built something that was not quite a proper medical device, but was close enough to keep the creature alive, if he did not make any mistakes, and did not sleep, and did not stop. He rigged an IV line from salvaged Varathi medical tubing, and he mixed a fluid compound from nutrient, paste, and mineral supplements, and a chemical cocktail that he calculated based on the Vraketh's listed biological requirements, and he fed it into a vein he found in the creature's neck, after 20 minutes of careful searching through cracked armor plates. Then he sat next to Ugly, and he monitored the fluid levels, and he adjusted the drip rate, and he checked the creature's breathing every few minutes, and he did not sleep for 42 hours. Somewhere around hour 30, the scavengers came. Cathara Prime was supposed to be devoid of complex life, but 3,000 years was a long time, and things had evolved in the toxic ruins, and they were not friendly things, because nothing that evolved on a battlefield was ever friendly. They were low and fast, and covered in bony plates, and they hunted in packs, and they had been drawn by the smell of Ugly's wounds, and they came scratching and snarling down the corridor toward the bunker. Ugly heard them first, tensed, and it tried to rise on legs that could not hold it, and a sound came from its throat that was a ghost of what must have once been a roar capable of shattering stone. Declan put his hand on the creature's neck and pushed it gently back down. "Stay," he said, and it was not a command, but a request. He picked up his plasma cutter in one hand and a length of salvaged pipe in the other, and he walked out into the corridor. The fight lasted 4 minutes, and it was not elegant, and it was not tactical, and it was a tired, hungry man with improvised weapons against 6 predators that had home field advantage. And when it was over, Declan was bleeding from his left arm and his right thigh, and he was limping badly, and 2 of the scavengers were dead, and the rest had decided he was not worth the effort. He walked back into the bunker, and sat down heavily next to Ugly, and blood dripped from his arm onto the floor. And Ugly made a sound. It was not a roar, and it was not a growl, and it was not any of the vocalizations listed in the Galactic database under Raketh Combat Communications. It was a whine, low and rumbling and unmistakable, and it was the sound of a creature that had been built for war, expressing something that no one had ever bothered to build into it. Concern. Ugly pushed its massive head forward and pressed it against Declan's wounded arm, so gently that this creature, which could bite through starship hull plating, did not even leave a mark. And it whined again, and its one gold eye looked up at him, and Declan, who had not cried in 11 years, felt his eyes sting. He put his hand on the creature's head, between the cracked armor plates, where the skin was warm and rough, and he said, "I am fine, you big ugly idiot, and do not worry about me." 1,200 miles above them, the Lorathi surveillance ship recorded everything. The footage was transmitted to 14 different intelligence agencies and scientific institutions, and every single one of them responded with some variation of the same message. That is impossible. But impossible or not, the footage was clear. Of Raketh was showing empathy, and a human was bleeding for it. And neither of them seemed to think this was unusual at all. On the 9th day, Declan finished repairing the coupling array with parts salvaged from the bunker. And on the 10th day, his ship hummed back to life. And he had a choice to make. He could fly off this rock and leave Ugly behind, and report the biosign and let the galaxy handle it, and everyone would understand. He stood in the cargo bay of his ship and looked at the space, and then he looked back at the bunker, where Ugly was watching him from the doorway with its one gold eye, and it made that rumbling sound again. And it was not a plea, because this creature did not know how to plead, and it was not a command, because this creature had only ever received commands, never given them. It was just a sound, the sound of something that did not want to be alone again. Declan spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cargo bay floor and widening the ramp. On the 11th day, he and Ugly left Cathara Prime together. Gannett Station was a mid-rim trade hub that saw 10,000 ships a day and had a reputation for being the kind of place where you could find anything and anyone, and where the security forces had seen it all and could not be surprised. That reputation died the moment Declan Harrow requested docking clearance, and his ship's manifest automatically flagged a biosign in the cargo bay that matched a creature the galaxy had spent 3,000 years being grateful was extinct. The docking controller stared at her screen for a full 10 seconds, and then she hit the emergency alert, and then every alarm on the station went off at once. Declan sat in his cockpit and listened to the sirens, and looked at the 17 incoming communications, all flashing urgent and hostile on his console. And he sighed and opened the general channel and said, "This is Commander Declan Harrow of the salvage vessel Lethe, requesting permission to dock, and before anyone says anything, no, I am not under duress, and yes, I know what is in my cargo bay, and no, it is not going to eat anyone." 17 voices started shouting at once. Permission to dock was denied, and then denied again, more loudly, and then a Krellin military cruiser that happened to be in the sector was called in and positioned itself between the station and Declan's ship, with its weapons hot and ready. Declan waited. He had been a Marine, and Marines were very good at waiting. After 6 hours of back and forth and threats and negotiations, and one memorable moment when a station administrator simply screamed incoherently into the comm for 30 seconds, a delegation was assembled to board his ship. They came in a shuttle with armed escorts and environmental suits, and enough firepower to level a city block, and they docked with the Lethe, and they walked through the airlock with the careful steps of people who expected to die at any moment. Declan met them in the corridor, offered them coffee, which none of them accepted. The delegation consisted of a Lorathi diplomatic attaché named Ven, who was trying very hard to appear calm, and a syndicate xenobiologist named Dr. Tessara, who was trying very hard not to appear excited, and a Krellin admiral named Morath, who was not trying to appear anything other than what he was, which was furious. They wanted to see the creature. Declan led them to the cargo bay and opened the door, and there was Ugly. Ugly was asleep. It was curled up in the center of the reinforced cargo bay floor, with its 6 legs tucked under its body, and its massive scarred head resting on one of Declan's old shirts that it had pulled off a storage hook and arranged into a nest, and it was snoring with a sound like a broken engine, and its cracked bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly with each breath like a dying heartbeat. Admiral Morath stared at it for a very long time. Dr. Tessara made a small sound that might have been awe or terror or both. Then the diplomat cleared his throat and began. He explained very carefully and very slowly, as though speaking to a child, or perhaps to someone who had suffered a recent head injury, that the creature sleeping on Declan's shirt was a Vrocketh, and that a Vrocketh was a bioengineered weapon of mass destruction created by the Vorathi Empire during the Great Wars, and that a single Vrocketh had been capable of clearing a continent of all higher life forms, and that the species was responsible for the confirmed extinction of 4 sentient races, and that the galactic community had unanimously agreed upon the classification of Vrocketh as a Class Omega existential threat, which was the highest threat designation that existed. Declan listened politely, and then said, "Her name is Ugly," then blinked and said, "I beg your pardon?" "I have been calling her Ugly," Declan said, "and I do not actually know if she is a her, but she feels like a her to me, and she likes it when I scratch behind the 3rd plate on the left side of her head." Admiral Morath stepped forward, and his voice was hard and controlled, and he said that this was not a pet, and this was not a joke, and this creature needed to be surrendered immediately for containment and euthanization, and that the human was risking not just his own life, but the lives of every being on this station, and potentially in this sector. Declan's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, and it was the same look that his old squad mates would have recognized as the look that meant Declan had decided something, and was not going to change his mind, regardless of what the universe threw at him. "No," he said. Morath said that this was not a request. Declan said that was fine, because his answer was not negotiable. What followed was 3 days of the most frustrating diplomatic standoff that Gannett Station had ever witnessed. Had once hosted a territorial dispute between 2 species that communicated through interpretive dance. So that was saying something. Declan cited the Terran Galactic Salvage Accords, which granted a salvager legal custody of any abandoned property recovered from unclaimed territory. And Cathara Prime was unclaimed territory. And Ugly had been abandoned, and the word disposal pending on her pod was not a claim of ownership, but an admission of abandonment. The Lorathi legal team pointed out that a weapon of mass destruction was not property under the Salvage Accords. Declan pointed out that calling Ugly a weapon was the whole problem, because she was not a weapon, and she was a living sentient creature who had been enslaved and discarded, and calling her a weapon was just a way to avoid feeling guilty about what had been done to her. Dr. Tessara, who had been quietly reviewing the bioscan data from the Lethe, said something that made the room go silent. The Vrocketh's neural scans showed cognitive activity consistent with high-level sapience and emotional processing that went far beyond anything in the historical Vorathi records, and she said that the creature appeared to be dreaming. Everyone looked at her. She said it again. The Vraketh was dreaming. Meanwhile, Ugly was waking up. She had been recovering steadily on the ship, and eating the nutrient compound that Declan prepared for her 3 times a day, and her body was beginning to remember what it was supposed to be, and her bioarmor was slowly regenerating, and her muscles were filling in beneath the scarred plates, and she was still thin and damaged, but she was no longer dying. She followed Declan everywhere. When he walked through the ship, she walked behind him, and her 6 legs moved with a silence that should have been impossible for something her size. And when he stopped, she stopped, and when he sat, she lay down next to him, and when anyone came near him, her one gold eye tracked them with an intensity that was not aggressive, but was very clearly a warning. She did not attack anyone. She did not even growl. But when Admiral Morath raised his voice during one of the negotiations and stepped toward Declan with his finger jabbing at the human's chest, Ugly stood up. All 6 legs unfolded, and she rose to her full height, which put her head above the Admiral's, and her eye looked down at him, and her acid glands, which were still mostly dry, made a faint hissing sound, and every person in the room stopped breathing. Morath stepped back. Ugly lay back down. Declan scratched behind the 3rd plate on the left side of her head and said, "Good girl." On the 4th day, Admiral Morath, who had run out of patience and legal arguments, asked Declan the question that everyone in the galaxy wanted to ask. He said, "Why are you doing this?" And he meant really why, not the legal reasons, and not the philosophical arguments, but the real reason that a lone human was willing to stand against the combined pressure of multiple galactic governments for a scarred, broken alien war beast that looked like a nightmare and had been built to end civilizations. Declan was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When I found her, she was in a box that said disposal pending, and she had been in that box for 3,000 years, and nobody came for her, and nobody remembered her, and the people who made her did not even think she was worth the effort of killing, and that is the worst thing I have ever seen, and I have seen a lot of bad things." He paused and then said, "Where I come from, when something is thrown away, and you find it, and you take care of it, then it is yours, and that is how it works, and I am not going to let anyone take her because she already had one set of owners who treated her like she was nothing, and I will not let that happen again." For a long time, and something in the old Admiral's expression shifted just slightly. The galactic courts agreed to a temporary injunction. Ugly could live under Declan's custody pending a full tribunal, and that was not a victory, but it was enough for now. But far away, in a part of the galaxy that still carried the old name of Varathi space, a communication was being decoded. The Varathi remnant had learned that one of their ancient weapons still functioned, and they wanted it back. In the weeks that followed the standoff at Gannett Station, something happened that no xenobiologist in the galaxy had predicted, and no military analyst had thought possible. Ugly got better, not slowly and not gently, but with the terrifying speed of a biological system that had been engineered to survive anything, including 3,000 years of neglect and starvation and the kind of damage that would have killed any natural creature 100 times over. Her bioarmor regenerated first, and the cracked and flaking plates on her hide thickened and darkened, until they had a density that made Dr. Tessara's scanning equipment give readings that the doctor initially assumed were errors because no organic material should have been that hard. Her muscles came back next, and the wasted skeletal frame filled out until she weighed over a metric ton, and the cargo bay floor groaned when she walked, and Declan had to reinforce it twice more with salvaged hull plating. Acid glands refilled, and Declan learned this the hard way when Ugly sneezed one morning and dissolved a section of wall paneling into a smoking puddle, and he stood there looking at the hole in his ship and said, We are going to have a conversation about that. And Ugly made a sound that might have been apologetic. Her bioluminescent markings were the last thing to return, and they came back slowly, like embers catching fire, and lines of pale gold light traced the patterns down her spine and across her flanks, and they pulsed with her heartbeat. And for the first time since she had been pulled from that pod, she looked like what she was supposed to be. And what she was supposed to be was terrifying. A fully restored Vrakith was a nightmare of biological engineering, standing nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, on 6 legs, built for speed and power, with jaws that could crush reinforced steel, and acid that could eat through ship armor, and bioarmor that could shrug off plasma, fire, and internal organs that allowed her to survive in the vacuum of space for short periods. She was a living weapon, the likes of which the galaxy had not seen in 3 millennia. She was currently sitting in Declan's cargo bay, chewing on a piece of rubber tubing that she had pulled from the engine room, and batting it around with her front paws like a cat with a toy. This was the part that broke people's brains. The galactic feeds were obsessed with Declan and Ugly, and the drone footage that Dr. Tessara had shared with the scientific community had gone viral in a way that transcended species barriers, because it turned out that every sentient species in the galaxy understood the concept of a man and his dog, even if the dog was a continent killer. They watched Ugly follow Declan around the ship and lie at his feet while he worked on repairs, and press her head against his hand when he reached down to scratch her, and make that low rumbling sound that Declan called her happy noise. They watched, and they did not understand, because the Vraketh were supposed to be mindless weapons, and this creature was clearly neither mindless nor simply a weapon. Dr. Tessara published her findings, and the scientific community had what could politely be described as a collective crisis. The Vraketh were intelligent. Not just animal intelligent, but genuinely sapient, with cognitive architecture that rivaled many recognized sentient species, and emotional processing capabilities that exceeded them. And the reason nobody had ever known this was because the Varathi had designed chemical suppressants into the Vraketh biology that kept their higher brain functions permanently leashed. Ugly had been in a failing stasis pod for 3,000 years, and the chemicals had broken down centuries ago, and her mind had been slowly waking up, even as her body deteriorated. And when Declan had opened that pod, he had not just freed a war beast, freed a person who had never been allowed to be a person before. And now that person was learning. She understood spoken language within weeks, and not just tone, but actual words. And Declan tested this by giving her simple choices, and she responded consistently and correctly. And when he said things like, "Do you want to go to the engine room or the cockpit?" she would walk to whichever one she preferred. She recognized names and faces on the comm screen, and she knew which ones made Declan happy and which ones made him tense. And when the ones that made him tense appeared, she would stand up and position herself behind him. She played. This was the thing that made hardened military officers go quiet when they saw the footage, because play is not something weapons do, and play is not something simple animals do with the kind of creativity that Ugly displayed. And she would take objects and hide them, and then find them, and bring them to Declan with obvious pride, and Declan would say, "Yes, that is very impressive. You found the wrench that you hid behind the coolant tank 10 minutes ago. You are a genius." And Ugly would rumble and wag her entire back end, because she did not have a tail, but the impulse was clearly there. The Varathi remnant made contact on a Tuesday. Their ship appeared at the edge of the system, and it was sleek and dark, and it carried the old imperial markings that most of the galaxy associated with things they would rather forget. And the communication it sent was formal and polite, in the way that a knife is polite when it's still in its sheath. The message was addressed to Declan, and it said that the Varathi remnant appreciated his efforts in recovering their lost asset, and that they were prepared to compensate him generously for its return, and that they looked forward to a productive exchange. Declan's response was 2 words, and neither of them was polite. The Varathi sent a longer message, explaining that the Vraketh was their intellectual property and their genetic creation, and that they had documentation going back millennia establishing their ownership, and that they intended to recover the specimen and study it, and if it proved viable, they would use the data to begin production of a new generation of bioweapons. Declan did not respond to this message at all. The boarding happened at night. Declan had docked at a small repair station on the outer rim for engine work, and the station was quiet and understaffed, and the Varathi retrieval team was very good at what they did. There were 6 of them, and they were equipped with old Varathi military technology that had been maintained and updated over the centuries. And they carried neural compliance devices and chemical restraint systems and control codes that had been passed down through generations specifically for this purpose. They cut through the Lethes airlock without triggering any alarms, and they moved through the ship in silence, and they found the cargo bay, and they found Ugly. She was asleep. The team leader activated the compliance signal. It was a frequency that had been hard-coded into every Vraketh ever created, a direct override of the brain's voluntary functions that shut down higher cognition and returned the creature to a base state of controlled aggression, responsive only to authorized commands. The signal hit Ugly like a physical blow. Her eyes snapped open and her body went rigid, and she rose to her feet in a single mechanical motion that had none of the fluid grace she had developed over the past weeks. And her pupil contracted to a pinpoint, and her acid glands activated, and her armor plates locked into combat configuration, and she stood there vibrating with restrained violence like a missile waiting for a target. The team leader smiled. He spoke a command word in Old Varathi, and it was the word for heal, word that had been used on 10,000 Vraketh across 100 conquered worlds, and it had never failed. Ugly took 1 step toward him, and then Declan's voice came from the corridor behind them. Ugly. Just her name. Not a command and not an override code, and not a frequency designed to hijack her nervous system, but just a name, given to her by a man who had found her in a box and decided she mattered. The Vraketh stopped. Her body was shaking, and the compliance signal was screaming through her brain, telling her to obey, telling her to submit, telling her to be what she had been made to be, and it was strong because it had been designed to be unbreakable. But something else was stronger. The gold light in her bioluminescent markings flared, and it was not a faint pulse, but a blaze that lit up the entire cargo bay, and it cascaded down her spine and across her flanks in waves, and her cracked markings that had been dark for 3,000 years burned bright with a light that the Varathi had never seen, because the Varathi had never let their creations live long enough or freely enough to produce it. It was not a combat response. It was a choice. Ugly turned away from the Varathi handler, and she walked across the cargo bay, and she stood next to Declan, and she pressed her armored head against his chest, and the rumble she made was deep enough to vibrate the deck plates. The team leader's smile was gone. Declan looked at the 6 Varathi operatives, and behind him stood a fully restored Vraketh that had just broken its own programming, and whose acid glands were primed, and whose 1 gold eye was looking at the people who had made her and put her in a box and left her to die. "You should leave," Declan said, and his voice was very calm and very quiet. They left. The sensor logs from the Lethe were transmitted to the Galactic Tribunal the next day. The moment a bioengineered weapon with 3,000 years of hard-coded obedience chose to override its own fundamental programming, not because it was commanded to, not because it was designed to, but because a human had been kind to it, and that changed everything. The Galactic Tribunal convened on Aethys Station, which was a neutral diplomatic platform that floated in the empty space between 3 major sectors, and had been specifically designed to host the kind of proceedings that could start wars if they went badly. This one could absolutely start a war if it went badly. The central chamber was enormous and circular and tiered, with seating for representatives of over 200 species, and every seat was full, because this was not just a trial about one creature and one human, but a trial about what the galaxy believed and what it was willing to do about it. The question before the tribunal was simple in the way that the most complicated questions always sound simple. Was the Vraketh known as ugly, a weapon to be destroyed, or a person to be protected? The Varathi remnant sent their best legal minds, and they sat in a block of dark formal robes, and they presented their case with the cold precision of people who had been preparing for this argument for generations, even if they had never expected to actually make it. They said that the Vraketh were created property, designed and manufactured by the Varathi Empire for military purposes, and that their genetic code was proprietary, and that ownership did not expire simply because time had passed, and that the creature was dangerous beyond calculation, and that the responsible course of action was to return it to Varathi custody for study and containment. Several other species supported the call for destruction, though not for the Varathi's reasons. The Cathali representative spoke, and her voice shook, because the Cathali were one of the 4 species that the Vraketh had driven to the edge of extinction 3,000 years ago, and they had survived, but only barely, and their cultural memory was long and painful. And she said that every Cathali child grew up hearing stories about the monsters that had come from the sky and devoured their. The syndicate representatives argued for caution and study, and a long quarantine that everyone understood was a polite way of saying imprisonment until death. And then it was Declan's turn. Commander Declan Harrow walked to the central platform, and he looked out at 200 species worth of faces. And he was not a diplomat, and he was not a lawyer, and he was not a scientist, and he was wearing the cleanest shirt he owned, which still had a small acid burn on the sleeve from when Ugly had sneezed. He did not have notes. He said, "I found her in a box underground on a planet that nobody visits because there is nothing left there worth visiting, and the box had a label on it that said, 'Disposal Pending,' and that means that 3,000 years ago somebody decided she was garbage." He paused. She had been in that box the whole time, and I do not know if she was aware during those years, or if she dreamed, or if there was nothing. When I opened that box, she was dying, and she was scared, and she was alone, and she had been alone for longer than most of your civilizations have existed. The chamber was very quiet. Everyone keeps telling me what she is, and they say she is a weapon, and they say she is a threat, and they say she is dangerous. And I am not going to stand here and tell you she is not dangerous, because she is, and I have seen what she can do, and it is terrifying. He looked at the Varathi delegation. But she did not make herself dangerous, and she did not choose to be what she is, and the people who made her are sitting right there, and they are the ones who took a thinking, feeling creature and turned it into a bomb. And then when the war was over, and they did not need bombs anymore, they did not set her free, and they did not give her a life, and they put her in a box, and they forgot about her. He turned back to the chamber. Dr. Tessera's research shows that the Varathith are sapient, and that they have always been sapient, and that the Varathi knew this because they specifically designed chemical systems to suppress that sapience, because a thinking creature might refuse to do what it was told, and they could not have that. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not anger exactly, but was close. So what you are actually asking me today is not whether she is dangerous, because we all know she is. And the answer to that does not matter, because lots of things are dangerous, and lots of people are dangerous, and we do not kill them for it. What you are actually asking is whether it is acceptable to create a sentient being and strip away its ability to think and feel and choose, and use it as a tool, and then throw it away when you are done. And if someone finds that being and gives it back its mind and its freedom, whether the correct response is to kill it because it scares you. Representative, and his expression softened. I understand why you are afraid, and I understand what was done to your people, and that is a real thing. And I will never tell you that your pain does not matter, because it does. But she did not choose to do those things, and she was not the one giving the orders, and she was a slave, and the people who held her leash are right there, and they want her back, so they can do it again. He pointed at the Vorathi delegation, and he did not raise his voice, but he did not need to. If your answer to finding out that a living thing can think and feel and choose is to kill it because you are afraid of what someone else might make it do, then you are not protecting the galaxy, and you are just finishing what the Vorathi started. He stepped back from the platform, and he was done. The deliberation lasted 9 hours. When it was over, the chief arbiter stood and read the decision, and the chamber was so quiet. Of the station's life support systems sounded loud. The Vraketh-designated Unit 0-Cat-9 was declared a sentient being under the full protection of the Galactic Sentience Accords. The Vorathi remnant's claim of ownership was struck down on the grounds that sentient beings could not be property. The production or creation of bioengineered war species was formally banned under a new accord that would bear the name of the creature at the center of the case. The Kethali representative voted in favor of the ruling, and when asked why, she said that her people had spent 3,000 years being defined by what had been done to them, and she would not do the same thing to another living being, no matter how much it hurt. Declan was granted permanent legal guardianship. He did not stay for the celebrations or the press conferences or the endless requests for interviews. He walked back to the Lethe, and he opened the cargo bay door, and Ugly was there, waiting for him the way she always was, with her one gold eye watching the door, and her bioluminescent markings pulsing gently, and her enormous body taking up most of the available floor space. He sat down next to her, and she pressed her head against his side, and he put his hand on her armored skull, and they sat there for a long time in silence. "Your name is Ket now," he said, "because I let you pick, and you responded to that one, and it is better than Ugly, even though you are still ugly, and I mean that with love." Ket rumbled. 6 months later, the Lethe was cruising through an uncharted system on the galactic rim where the stars were young and the planets were unnamed, and the nearest populated station was weeks away. Declan had taken a survey contract because the pay was decent and the work was quiet. And after everything that had happened, quiet was exactly what he wanted. The cargo bay had been renovated, and it was not really a cargo bay anymore, was instead something closer to a den with reinforced bedding that Ket had arranged to her satisfaction, and a viewport that Declan had installed because he had noticed that she liked to watch the stars, and he thought she deserved a window after spending 3,000 years in a box without one. He brought the ship down on an unnamed garden world because his legs needed stretching, and the sensors said the air was clean and the gravity was comfortable, and there was nothing on the surface that would try to eat them, which made a pleasant change. He opened the cargo ramp, and sunlight poured in, real sunlight from a real star, not the artificial lighting of stations and ships. And Ket stood at the top of the ramp and went very still. She had never been in sunlight before. The pod she had been born in was underground, and the wars she had fought were on worlds that burned, and the box she had slept in was buried in darkness, and in her entire long and terrible existence, she had never once stood in the open air of a living world under a sky that was not full of smoke. The light hit her bioluminescent markings, and they responded in a way that Declan had never seen before, and they did not just pulse, but blazed with a steady warm gold that ran the entire length of her body like veins of sunlight under her armored skin. She walked down the ramp slowly, and her 6 legs touched grass for the first time, and she stopped and looked down at it, and then she looked up at the sky, and then she looked at Declan. And then she did the single most undignified thing that an ancient bioengineered weapon of mass destruction had ever done in the history of the galaxy. She flopped onto her side and rolled in the grass. She rolled, and she kicked her 6 legs in the air, and she made sounds that were not growls and not roars, but were something closer to joy than anything the Varathi had ever imagined their creation could feel. Her massive body, and she did not care, and the sunlight played across her armor, and her markings blazed gold. And she was not a weapon, and she was not a threat, and she was not disposal pending. She was alive, and she was free, and she was home. Declan sat on the ramp with his legs dangling over the edge, and he watched her and he laughed, and it was a good laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and real, and he could not remember the last time he had laughed like that. Somewhere far away, the galactic feeds were running stories, and the scientists were publishing papers, and the politicians were making speeches, and none of it mattered here, on this unnamed world, where a man and his dog were sitting in the sun. The galaxy would later ask how one human had done what entire empires could not, and how one man, with no special training and no advanced technology, had reached a creature that had been designed to be unreachable. They wrote papers about it and gave lectures about it and debated it in academic halls for years. And they made it complicated because that is what the galaxy does with things it does not understand. But the answer was never complicated. The answer was that Declan Harrow had found a broken, abandoned thing in the dark, and he had not been afraid of it, and he had not tried to control it, and he had not walked away from it. He had just been kind. And it turned out that in a galaxy full of weapons and empires and ancient terrors and species that could bend space and shatter worlds, the most powerful thing in the universe was still just one person deciding that another living thing mattered. That was enough.